In this module, we will discuss about the when, what and how the payment of taxes will be made under the Goods and Services Tax. Before we move on to understand on the payments under GST, let us first try to know how the payment workflow would be there under GST. So the details and data keyed in by a registered dealer would be first processed by the application service providers, also called as the ASPs, and then it would be passed on to the GST Suvidha providers, that is GSP, and finally the data will be entered into the GST network. Thus, ASP and GSP will provide the much needed support to the taxpayers in the IT ecosystem for GST. With the Digital India drive being adopted by the current government, GST is encouraging to make most of the payments electronically. Therefore, any payment greater than 10,000 would have to be compulsorily required to be made electronically under the GST law. All the payments less than Rs 10,000 can be paid by cash or check at the government authorized banks. While we discussed the threshold for payment of GST electronically, we now discuss what are the types of ledgers to be maintained under GST. So, the three main types of ledger under GST for payments are liability ledger, which is form PMT1, credit ledger, which is form PMT2, and cash ledger, which is form PMT5. Now let us discuss each of the ledgers in details. We begin with electronic tax liability ledgers, which is form GST PMT1. In this ledger, the total tax liability of a taxpayer after netting off for the particular month will be shown. This ledger will be automatically displayed on a GST taxpayer's dashboard. This ledger needs to be maintained by all the registered taxpayers in an electronic form. It displays details such as tax due from a regular tax return, interest, penalty, and demand notice under each of the major heads. Payments can also be made using the input tax credit available in the electronic credit ledger. Let us look at how the electronic tax liability would look like. So it would have details like serial number, date, reference number, description, type of transaction, details of CGST, SGST and IGST broken down into details like tax, interest, penalty, fees, others and the total. And finally, the details of the balance tax payable. It would be further broken down into tax, interest, penalties, fees and others. A few points to be noted for this form are that all the liabilities accruing due to the return and payments made against the liabilities would be recorded in this ledger. Liabilities for opting composition, cancellation of registration will also be covered in this part. Such liabilities shall be populated in the liability register of the tax period in which the date of application or order falls, as the case may be. Return would be treated as invalid if the closing balance is positive. We now move on to discuss the next ledger, which is the electronic credit ledger. This ledger is maintained in form PMT2. So let us understand electronic credit ledger a bit in detail. In this ledger, input tax credit as self-assessed in the monthly returns will be reflected here. The credit in this ledger can be used to make the payment of tax only, and no other amount such as interest, penalties, fees, etc. would be allowed to be paid through this ledger. Every claim of input tax credit is credited to this ledger. Electronic credit ledger can be debited to the extent of discharge of any liability. Amounts to the extent of refund claim on unutilized amount to be debited from the ledger. Input tax credit on the following can be transferred to the electronic credit ledger. Input tax credit available to the branch for amount of credit transfer by the input service distributor. Input tax credit on inputs held in stock, semi-finished and finished goods if GST registration is applied within 30 days of the liability of tax. Input tax credit on input held in stock, semi-finished and finished goods by a taxpayer in the composition scheme and who is getting converted to a normal taxpayer would also be allowed to be transferred under the electronic credit ledger. Input tax credit on taxes paid under the reverse charge mechanism would be allowed to be credited in this ledger. And finally, input tax credit on goods or services used for business and other purposes to the extent applicable for business purpose would be allowed to be credited to this ledger. Now let us quickly look at how the electronic credit ledger or form GST PMT2 would look like. It would include details like serial number, date, reference number, tax period, description, type of transaction, details of CGST, SGST and IGST paid, and further categorized into the matched taxes, mismatched taxes, provisional taxes and the total amount of taxes paid. And finally, the balance amount in the ledger, which would be further segregated into categories like matched, mismatched, provisional and the total of all. Important points to be noted for this form are that the credit of inputs, capital goods, reverse charge claimed in this return, credit received through input service distributor, credit on account of merger, pre-registration, etc. will be recorded separately in this ledger. Utilization of credit from the same major head or from the other major head, that is cross utilization, will be recorded accordingly. Utilization of credit for return and other than return related liabilities will be recorded separately. Refund claim from input tax credit ledger will be reduced and if rejected or withdrawn will be credited back. Lastly, we will discuss the cash ledger. This ledger will reflect all the deposits made in cash and TDS or TCS made on account of the taxpayer. This ledger can be used for making any payment on account of GST. Unlike any other ledgers, this ledger needs to be maintained by all the registered taxable persons in electronic form for crediting the amount deposited and debiting the payment. The deposit shall be made through any of the following modes. It can be made through the internet banking through authorized banks, through credit or debit card, through NEFT, that is National Electronic Fund Transfer, through RTGS, that is real-time gross settlement from any bank, OTC, that is over-the-counter payment through authorized banks for deposit up to Rs 10,000. Payments can be made under three different major heads of GST, that is Central Goods and Services Tax, State Goods and Services Tax, and Integrated Goods and Services Tax. It is further divided into different minor heads like tax, interest, penalty, fees, and others. Electronic cash ledger to be debited for the total value for payments of any major or minor head combination. It displays the balance available through various combination of the major and minor heads. Refunds received by the taxpayer gets reflected in this ledger. Let us now look at the form GST PMT 5. It includes details like serial number, date, reference number, tax period, description, type of transaction, details of CGST, SGST and IGST, further segregated into details like tax, interest, penalty, fees, others, and total of all. And finally, the closing balance of the ledger, which is further divided into tax, interest, penalty, fees, others, and finally the total of all. Like any other form, following are few of the important details that needs to be noted for this form. First and the foremost is that the reference number includes BRN, which is bank reference number, debit entry number, order number if any, acknowledgement number of return in case of TDS and TCS credit. Tax period, if applicable for any debit, will be recorded, otherwise it will be left blank. GST in of deductor or collector, that is e-commerce operators, challan identification number of the challan against which the deposit has been made. Cash balance transferred from cash ledger of transferor of business, type of liability for which any debit has been made will also be recorded under the description. Application number, if any, show cause notice number, demand ID, pre-deposit for appeal or any other liability for which payment is being made will also be recorded under the description. And finally, refund claim from the ledger or any other debits made will be recorded in this ledger. With this, we end our module on payment of taxes under GST. In the next module, we will discuss about the input tax credits.